Welcome, Tony, to the Value Podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. We're so grateful you could be here. We know you're a very busy guy, so thank you for coming. Do you want to introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure. My name is Tony Brown. I teach Russian and also Russian culture at BYU. I've been there since 2004. And over the years, my specialties have varied. I started in what's called language policy. And that drew me to Ukraine and Belarus and that area where there are multiple languages spoken. And then I also did some work in what's called second language acquisition. And now I'm doing what I especially love, and that's Russian cultural studies. So
Nice.
Great.
So you probably heard about the craziness going on in Ukraine.
Yep.
Safe to say.
A little familiar with it.
We could catch you up if you wanted.
a little familiar.
So I know you from, I took your class a couple years ago.
Yep.
And I was the one crazy person who didn't serve their mission in Russia or had no Russian experience. I just wanted to learn about Russia.
Not crazy at all. In fact, it's really wonderful, I think, when students who haven't had that perspective come to the class because they lend a fresh perspective on it.
Yeah, it was a great
That's really
experience for me because it was a totally different cultural experience than I had had, right? And like you said, I was kind of an outsider into the class, so it was so fun to talk to my different classmates who had the experiences that I hadn't. So yeah, it was really interesting. But you were a great professor,
Well, thank you.
so we invited you here today.
Thank you.
But you recently returned from a trip to Eastern Europe. I'd love for you to speak just a little bit as to how maybe the climate was there and maybe just some things that you noticed during your travels there.
Sure. So I headed over to Poland on the 6th of March. And the reason that I went there is because I have students doing internships there. From there, I went to Latvia, where I also have students and
Currently doing internships?
Currently
Okay.
doing internships. My travel, of course, coincided with what's happening over there right now in Ukraine. Poland especially is caught up in this because of their border with Ukraine and so many refugees pouring into Poland. When I was there, quite frankly, the only thing that I noticed that was different was that there were people gathered outside the train station, holding flags, singing songs on the street, people trying to raise money and this, that, and the other. I was there soon enough, or shortly after the actual invasion, so it wasn't as obvious as it is now.
Yeah.
The numbers of refugees at the time were approaching 500,000.
Wow.
Now we're over 1.5 million, 2 million in Poland, somewhere around
So
there.
Just in
fast.
Poland alone. Wow.
The total number of refugees is over 3 million now. So this is, as you know, far and away the largest refugee crisis since World War II.
Yeah.
Jeez.
And Poland most definitely has carried the brunt of this.
Yeah.
And to their credit, they have welcomed in these refugees with open arms. And I think part of that stems from their history of remembering what it was like to be occupied
Yeah.
during the Soviet era. And there's a level of compassion that's very tangible there. And as I said, I think it stems from that firsthand experience of what happened during World War II. Ukrainians, those who are fleeing, as you know, are mostly women and children.
Yeah.
Men, for all intents and purposes, are staying and taking up arms to defend. These refugees are moving into all different places, into Hungary, into Romania, now into France, and then up into Latvia, Lithuania,
Wow.
and all the way up into the Netherlands. So
Wow.
it's a mass exodus, you could say. In Latvia, it was less noticeable from the standpoint of seeing, gatherings. The only gatherings that I saw there were in front of the Russian embassy and the Ukrainian embassy, which incidentally are side by side.
Oh, that's got to be fun.
Wow.
Yeah. And so as you're walking down the street there, what you'll find in front of the Russian embassy are people that are protesting in the form of putting out posters and, you know, verbal statements of opposing the war. And then as you continue on the street and come to the Ukrainian embassy, it's night and day difference. It's lined with candles, basically.
Wow.
It's like a vigil, and flowers and people, very sort of somber.
In Latvia,
Yeah.
you said?
So here we have these two embassies side by side, which I think reflects this situation geographically. Also, these are neighbors. These are
Yeah.
brother countries,
Huh.
and the tragedy of all of this is that this isn't just competing nations. These are families.
Yeah.
And it's hard to find a Russian family that doesn't have relatives in Ukraine and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so it's not like, you know, where you can walk down this street and have the Russian embassy and the Ukrainian embassy and, like a demarcation between the two. In real life, they're very fluid in terms of actual
Super
family
intertwined.
dynamics. They're very intertwined.
Yeah.
And this is the real tragedy. People feel this on a very personal level there.
Wow.
If you go also a little further into the city, you'll come to this what's called the Monument of Freedom in Riga, Latvia.
Mm-hmm.
And at night, it's lit up in blue and yellow to show solidarity. And thanks, I would say, to the credit of the president in Latvia, he's gone out of his way to say that it's not for us to judge the actions of, or it's not for us to judge the Russian people by the actions of their government.
Yeah.
And I think that's especially important when you have a country like Latvia that has a very large ethnic Russian population, and it's all too easy to judge them as though they were somehow accountable for what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah. It's kind of like the hate crimes that happened in the U.S. because with COVID and people that were from China, people persecuting them. So he's going out of his way to make sure that doesn't happen.
Very much
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
That's really cool.
What would you say your response would be? Because we have seen a lot of that anti-Russian sentiment here in the U.S. as well.
Mhm.
Even just from my own experience, I had in an orchestra right now, and one of my conductors we were playing a Tchaikovsky piece,
Oh,
and
yeah.
he had to cut the piece because he's a Russian composer, and I really had to grapple with that because Tchaikovsky is not the issue.
Yeah.
And to demonize, this great cultural piece that is Russia and that is Russian culture and history, I think we lose a lot as an American people, but also we are demonizing the people of Russia and not, Putin or what the actual crisis of the issue is.
Yeah.
What would be your response to that?
Well, that's disheartening to hear.
Yeah.
In no way, shape, or form should the music of Tchaikovsky be sort of conflated with the actions of the current president of the Russian Federation, in my opinion. It's human nature, I think, to want to be able to point the finger, to have an object, so to say, of that projection of anger. It's much more difficult to withdraw that projection and to see that shadow figure instead of being out there in here, and being willing to recognize that we all have those dark sides in us instead of so easily jumping to that natural tendency to want to find the enemy without. This certainly wouldn't be the first time that something like this has happened. Go back to the days of World War II, before the Soviet Union was our ally, right? And a colleague of mine recalls growing up in Cincinnati during World War II, And the Cincinnati Opera was performing one of the great Russian operas by Modest Mussorgsky called Boris Godunov. And people were protesting out in front of the opera house, again,
Wow.
for the same reason. So this is not a new phenomenon. It's something that I think we have to grapple with each time something like this happens.
I love that. Just pointing out we didn't just kind of start putting the blame now in the 21st century. It's happened in the past. It's not a new thing that's come out with smartphones. Age of information.
During the Soviet Union, the same thing. I mean, there was the natural tendency to demonize the Russian people. But the Russian people and the Soviet government were two entirely different things. And so it is even today, even though there's not the Soviet Union. Still, there's the Russian people, and then
The Russian government.
there's the Russian government.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize that they are not one and the same.
You talked a lot about the refugees. Do you see that continuing just to get worse and worse? Like what? Do you have any projections
well, here we are
for that?
already at 3 million plus. And unfortunately, I think the fighting is going to rage on for probably quite a while to come.
Think like years, 6 months?
No, I hope not. I certainly
Yeah.
hope not. But thus far, we've seen cities like Kharkov, Mariupol come under heavy attack. And now Kiev is very much on the radar. Kiev being the capital with the largest population of any Ukrainian city stands to suffer probably the most also because of its symbolic quality of being the capital. And to capture Kiev is, for Putin, really the prize. And it's not going to fall without a serious fight. And Ukrainians, as Zelensky said, even as recently as today, they will fight to the death to save their city. So what that means is what we've seen thus far in terms of out-migration is only the beginning of what I foresee as being an even larger exodus, especially as residents from Kiev begin to flee.
Wow.
Maybe backing up a little bit, talking about how this conflict started in the first place, could you give maybe a brief cultural or historical overview as to how Russia came to this place? That's a broad question, but maybe why Ukraine is so critical for them, or why the government made this decision to invade Ukraine.
So I think it's important to look at the history of Ukraine within the context of the broader development of what we now call Russia. The first major, what you could call a government, so to say, major government, really has its home in Kiev. This is 10th century. And the Grand Duke, or the Grand Prince, rather, of Kiev, Vladimir, was really instrumental in uniting all of the different principalities. And one of the ways that he did that was by bringing a form of religion that wasn't practiced in any of the other parts of that region of the other principalities, but it created a unifying force, and that, of course, being Christianity. He was baptized in a city that is today known as Kherson, and that very act, and then subsequently requiring others to be baptized also in the Dnieper River there, flows through Kiev, was really the beginning of this new powerful religion that united the people of what was called the Rus. Over time, the seat of power shifted, largely due to an invasion from the Mongols, and it went to Vladimir and eventually to Moscow. There was a consolidation of power, not only politically, but of ecclesiastical power in Moscow, such that the Patriarchate and the Tsar were very close in terms of their power. Rome was, of course, the center of the Christian church, but Rome fell, and Constantinople became the next center of the church. Constantinople fell too, though, to the Turks in 1453. And so the Russians, looking on, saw what was happening, and they had inherited Christianity from Constantinople, which had inherited Christianity from Rome. So you can see this chain: Rome, Constantinople, and meanwhile, the Church of Moscow is saying, "You see what happens when you go astray? You're taken over by other powers. First Rome fell, second Rome fell. That means there's a third Rome, and that is Moscow." And the saying went, "And a fourth Rome there will not be." In other words, we are the bearers of the true faith, and this is the last. This is where it will stay until Christ's return. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind when you look at what's happening in Ukraine, because for Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, someone who also considers the collapse of the Soviet Union to be the single worst disaster of the 20th century, he looks at those borders of Ukraine and Belarus as being very artificial. And instead, what he looks at is Russia from a broader perspective of this spiritual space, or what he uses the term, the Russian world. And that Russian world extends to where all Slavs are that embrace Russian Orthodoxy. And the saying is, to be Russian is to be Orthodox. So they're really inseparable in that sense. And so when he looks at Ukraine, he doesn't see it as this separate state, so to say. He sees it as historically part of. It is
Russia.
It is. We are all one people.
So the map in his mind is completely different.
The map in his mind is very different. And these what we call these, boundaries demarcating states, or for him are merely, political. You could say they're man-made. So to bring Ukraine back into the fold has more than just political ramifications. For him, it's about righting a wrong. In other words, restoring what should have been there all along. And so while when you go to Kiev, you'll see a statue of Vladimir looking out over the river where people were baptized. Ukrainians look to him as really the founder of that Russian Orthodoxy and really being central to their history. But now if you go to Russia, as of just a few years ago, you'll find a similar statue in Moscow near the Kremlin. And that was Putin putting that there and his way of saying, Vladimir is ours. He's not Ukrainian per se. He is all all of the Russian peoples.
Interesting.
And so for him, the designation of Ukrainian and Belarusian is merely just
It's a formality.
It is.
Weird
It's somewhat of
title.
a formality. But it doesn't carry weight for him.
Interesting.
So is he waging a political battle? Is he waging a ideological battle? It's kind of hard to separate the two because they're so interwoven for him.
Do you think that that could be it though? I mean, I don't want to put myself in his shoes, but he's completely destroying the economy in Russia and the people in their lives. Is that all that's behind it?
Well, when you say that, is that all that's behind it? What do you mean?
Is there something else that you think we're missing?
Well, there's no doubt that he is wreaking havoc on the economy there.
Yeah.
Russians are unable to use their credit cards at most banks because they're frozen.
Taking off the SWIFT system.
Yeah, taking off the SWIFT system.
They can't get cash, right?
Yeah.
No, nothing.
The transnational companies are pulling out left and right. Sanctions on multiple banks. It's becoming difficult to buy even your standard food products in some places, just because there isn't that steady stream of imports, exports like there was. This also isn't a new phenomenon. I mean, when you consider what happened after the revolution.
It's not the first time Russian leaders
No.
have decimated their people.
Yeah, after the revolution, this was also very much what we saw too, where they isolated themselves from the rest of the world. And basically went at it alone. And Putin is saying, our people will rise to the occasion. Our economy will benefit from this in the long run. I suppose time will tell. It's very difficult in the 20th century, I think, to cut yourself off from the world economy.
Yeah,
It's a different world than it was in 1917.
totally.
And Russians are feeling the squeeze, and they will continue to feel the squeeze as we heighten our sanctions. Many wonder if ultimately this will, if there will be a breaking point. During the Soviet Union, Reagan's arms race was less so about, increasing the number of ICBMs, so to say, and more so about bankrupting the Soviet Union. And so today people look at what's happening over there and see a parallel in this. Perhaps by increasing the sanctions and putting the pressure on Putin, the people themselves will rise up and call for regime change.
Do you think that's even possible, though, with the way that the Russian government is just kind of has a chokehold on its country? Do you think that a revolution would even be possible?
It's so hard to say. Very few would have predicted the way that 1991 would have
that's
played
true.
out. I was a freshman at BYU studying Russian, and I remember all too well Christmas Day when Gorbachev announced the collapse, basically the end of the Soviet Union. Very few would have anticipated that. The August coup in 1991, of course, surprised everyone too. And there's speculation that maybe there will be something to that, to that effect now, but that's only speculation. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
When you look at Putin meeting with his closest advisors and they're sitting 20 feet apart, it's not because of COVID.
Yeah.
It's because he can't trust anyone, even in his closest circle.
Oh.
That's why he has a food taster, and that's why he's very skeptical of anyone.
So all that stuff's true. Like he actually has a food taster, and
Yeah.
that's the reason for the separation. Because you see stuff like that on social media, and you're like, oh, that's just like clickbait. I guess it's true. Wow. That's so crazy.
It's crazy. So you've talked a little bit about maybe how Putin or other Russian leaders view Russia in the broad term. Would you say that Ukrainians view themselves as part of Russia as well, or do they, like Russia in the broader term,
Right.
or do they view things differently?
There is a definite Ukrainian history.
Yes.
And historically, Russia has tried to whitewash that in the way that they've also tried to whitewash the reality of a Ukrainian language. I mean, this is very important if you're trying to deny a people's identity, deny their language, right? Deny their history.
Wow.
And this isn't, like I said, a new phenomenon either. This, if you go back to 1700s, this was happening in Tsarist Russia, and then continued throughout the centuries. Ukrainians, as I said before, and Russians are so intertwined. It's hard not to be able to see oneself as both. So many children grow up in homes where the mother is either Russian or Ukrainian, and the father likewise is either Russian or Ukrainian, where you'll have a mixed marriage of Ukrainian and Russian. That's very typical, actually, in many places. And so, what does it mean to be Ukrainian when you grow up in a home like that? Well, you can't help but also identify with Russia just because of your lineage in that sense, and vice versa if you grow up in Russia with a Ukrainian parent.
Your family, just like you said earlier.
It's hard to whitewash it.
Yeah, and so on the one hand, there's this sense of we are a family of Eastern Slavs. And yet at the same time, I think Ukrainians, rightly so, pride themselves in their history, and they should be able to. Unlike their neighbor Belarus, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they really made a point of strengthening their national identity through their language and through their history. Belarus struggled in that way. And so there's not that sense of really a distinct identity from Russia like you'll find in a very pronounced manner in Ukraine. And I can only say that because I did my PhD work in Belarus and I served a mission there. I was called to Kiev, Ukraine, but I should mention that I lived in Ukraine even before my mission. And so this place is near and dear to my heart.
Dang.
I lived in Kiev, and
how'd you wind up living there before your mission?
well, as I said, I was a freshman at BYU and the Soviet Union collapsed, and I thought, I've got to figure out a way to get over there as soon as I can. And so after the winter semester, I arranged to get over to Kiev and lived with the family there. This was, this is right in the aftermath of the collapse, and so the economy's in a terrible state. But there was a euphoria in the air. People were so excited about the prospect of a free country, of being able to start anew, and to be able to have their own identity. And so there was this real hope, you could say, in the air of a new life for Ukraine. After that summer, I came back to BYU, lived in the Russian house, and got a mission call to go right back.
Oh, cool. That must have been a happy
So
day.
I knew the mission president, I knew the missionaries, because
That's
I
so
worked
cool.
closely with them.
Yeah.
And my mission president, I think to his credit, thought, this guy knows too many people here. So
Send him to Belarus.
I didn't even spend a single full day in Kiev when I was on my mission.
Wow.
The day I got there, he put me on a train up to
He's
Kharkiv.
like, nope.
Yeah, he sent me up to Kharkiv, and I was there only for a month, and then he came up and he said, you're going up to Belarus.
Was that the same mission? At the time?
At the time it was. And he was actually kind of clever because he knew, none of us did, that in about a month, the mission actually would split.
Oh.
And then Donetsk would go one way, and then Kiev would go the other way. And Kharkov was going to be in the Donetsk mission, so he sent me up to
So you're in the other
Belarus,
mission.
and so I stayed with him.
Oh,
That
there
is
you
cool.
go.
Yeah.
Sneaky guy.
So yeah, it was kind of clever on his part, but it was a wonderful experience. I was able to have both the Ukraine experience and the Belarus experience, and they're very different. I mean, as you can see right now, Belarus is basically just a staging ground for Putin to do
Yeah.
whatever he wants, and he can run roughshod over them.
Yeah.
Whereas with Ukraine, it's most definitely a firewall there.
Interesting.
Wow.
That history gives a lot greater context to the way they're responding. So that makes a lot of sense.
Well, my uncle said it's a totally like Western view to think Vladimir just, you say his name way cooler than I do, by the way. That we just think he popped his head out of bed and like, oh, I'm just gonna go take over Ukraine, because that's what we see in the media, right? We wake up and
It's like,
oh,
he's
he's
crazy. All of a
going to
sudden,
war
he's
with
making
them.
this
Yeah.
decision.
he just snapped one day, when there's hundreds of years of
Oh,
history
yeah.
there that is
Yeah.
behind it. I'm sure it's been something, or at least you kind of make it sound like it's been something on his mind for a long, long time.
I think there's
So-
no question actually about that.
Wow.
This has been you know, to be fair, if you had asked me a month ago if Russian troops actually would invade, I would have said no.
Really?
Yeah, I didn't think that it would happen. I thought it was brinksmanship basically on
Yeah.
his part to be able
Just
to
talk.
make NATO stand down. He wanted to be able to get concessions from NATO, but we weren't willing to give them. I mean, we weren't willing to say that no, Ukraine will never become a NATO country. And I guess I find comfort in the fact that even many in Putin's closest circles were surprised. This
Really?
this was not an action that many people thought he would actually take.
Why is that a comforting fact to you?
Well, I guess it's comforting for me only because I thought I was dead wrong.
Like, I wasn't the only one who
Yeah,
tripped.
exactly.
That's funny.
And the funny thing was, even just a few days before it actually began, I was listening to an interview with Andrew Sullivan and Applebaum, Ann Applebaum, who's a real expert in that area, and she was like, "There's no way this would happen." So
Wow.
it took a lot of people by surprise, myself included, that he would actually go in.
Wow.
That's interesting to hear. Maybe just as we begin to wrap up, we'll ask one final question and then invite everyone to share their thoughts. But what do you feel like, okay, this is a two-part question. Should Ukraine join NATO if it were possible? And then also, what should the U.S. involvement be in Ukraine and why?
Yeah. So as to your first question, I do not buy the argument that some people use, including Putin, that the U.S., or rather NATO, went back on its word after they said NATO will not expand.
Mm-hmm.
The Soviet Union collapsed. Republics that were part of the former Soviet Union experienced a long sought after freedom, but they also wanted protection from the very country that had occupied them for 75 years. And so it wasn't NATO going to Poland or NATO going to the Baltic states and saying, you have to join us. On the contrary, it was those countries, sovereign nations, coming to NATO and saying, we want to join NATO and become a part of this alliance.
Yeah.
I think that NATO was in every way justified to grant them membership. And for Putin to suppose that he could dictate whether they could join or not, I think is completely unfounded. Why should he be able to dictate whether a sovereign nation can or cannot join NATO? So I don't buy that argument that, or some people will say, well, what if countries, on the border of the U.S. like Mexico joined an alliance with Russia? I would say, Well,
we don't have a say
you know
in
what?
that.
If they made the choice to do that, it would be one thing.
Yeah.
And in this case, the countries that joined NATO, they did it voluntarily. They did
Of
it
their own
willingly,
accord.
of their own accord. This
Mhm.
is what they wanted. And I think as sovereign nations, they should have the right to do that.
Mm.
When it comes to what the U.S. should do to help Ukraine, in the short term, I think we most definitely should continue to support them in terms of providing military support.
Mhm.
I don't agree with the no-fly zone in terms of going in. That is a red line.
It's pretty
for Putin.
extreme.
Yeah. And once you do that, then you're asking for it in terms
You're
of
inviting war.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't go there, but I think that we most definitely should be actively engaged in supplying support in the way of arms, defense systems, and so forth, and supporting the government, even if the government has to go into exile, supporting them in the same way that the government in Poland had to go into exile during World War II.
Think it's going to get to that point?
I don't. Who knows?
Yeah.
It's so
You know,
hard to
crystal
say.
ball.
Yeah, I wish that I had one. But I think that we must definitely should be supportive of them, and I'm confident that the day will come. I don't know how this will all play out when the Ukrainian people will be able to rebuild their country.
Mm.
And I sincerely hope that the U.S. will play an active role in that rebuilding process, not only physically, but also in terms of rebuilding a democratic nation that can, withstand the geopolitical pressure that Russia places on it.
Yeah. It's a beautiful thought, kind of a hopeful bow on the situation.
I have
Sorry,
to
go
ask
ahead.
one question
Yeah.
just really quick. Do you think by us providing military support to Ukraine that Vladimir is going to think that's an act of war, or eventually just going to piss him off too much? Or
Well, it's hard to say. And he's already said that as far as other nations supporting Russia in the form of arms, he views any kind of, let's say, transfer of arms as a viable target.
Mm.
So if we're sending transport vehicles into Ukraine with armaments, as far as he's concerned, that's fair game.
Mm.
I don't think that he would go as far as saying, by sending in arms, we can now launch missiles into Poland. That would be.
He couldn't justify
I
that.
think that no, I don't think that he would go that far.
Yeah.
That's hopeful.
If he did, of course, it
For
would
now.
Yeah,
create-
for now.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, a month ago, I would have told you I didn't think he would have invaded Ukraine. So
That's
So things can
crazy.
change, yeah, on
things
a
can
dime.
change. Yeah,
Do you agree with all the sanctions that the U.S. has been placing on Russia?
I do think that they are needed. One of the concerns that I have, there's a sort of domino effect once you start sanctioning companies, and it's driven also by pressure from within. In other words, if one U.S. company pulls out and another doesn't, then they look
Makes
at
them
that
look
company,
bad.
and they say, "Hey, why aren't you patriotic? Why aren't
Yeah.
you
So
also?"
you support Russia.
Yeah, you must be supporting Russia in this war. The problem with that is that some companies actually ought to stay in, like
Gas companies.
media companies.
Oh,
I'm thinking.
Yes, yeah.
Because we desperately need that, that
The direct
open
source of information.
communication, so that people in Russia can get a source of information other than what they hear over Channel 1.
Well, even things like Instagram or TikTok
Right,
or
are
things.
being shut
Yeah,
down.
like they just shut
Today,
down Instagram.
BBC was shut
Yeah.
down. And so that has been somewhat problematic in the sense of media companies pulling out.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have to see how that. In general, yes, I support the idea of the sanctions, and I think that it's a necessary form of pressure on individuals, including very wealthy oligarchs. And as you know, Putin has surrounded himself with oligarchs. And so if they are feeling the pressure,
it's a good sign.
Just got to keep capturing their yachts,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
For real.
Well, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share on the situation or anything that we've talked about?
Well, I would just say perhaps I'm an optimist in this, but I do think that history is on Ukraine's side. There is something to be said for people defending their family, their homes, their country, and in the case of World War II, I think one of the reasons why the Russians fought so doggedly was because they felt like they were defending their homeland. In this case, Russia is the aggressor. And it's harder, I think, for the soldiers going into Ukraine, not even knowing why they're really there, to feel like they have
the pressure,
a cause to fight for. Whereas their brothers in Ukraine most definitely feel like they have a cause to fight for. So morale is flagging in amongst the Russian military, whereas it's only increasing, I would say, in Ukraine. So I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, some way, somehow. The people of Ukraine will be able to prevail.
So it really sounds like, and I just thought of this, if Russia loses, right? Nothing really comes of it, then Russia's really going to have to rebuild too, in a way that's probably going to be a lot more desperate than Ukraine. I'm sure every country's going to want to support them in rebuilding. I doubt there's going to be very many people that are just going to support Russia in what they have to rebuild.
And how that will play out again
could be really interesting.
It's difficult to say, but in the event that, again, Russia has to stand down, and then we begin the negotiation process. My hope is that Western nations won't put such a heavy burden on Russia like we did with Germany after World War I. That we'll have a repeat of it in,
another version of World War II.
30 years, when they just feel like, we have been unfairly burdened with this.
Villainized.
And then lash out. I hope that we can find a way to be able to rebuild together. And again, not demonize the Russian people, but really recognize that these are the actions of very few people in the government, and punishment should be meted out accordingly.
I think the real value that I got from this podcast is it really reaffirmed what my uncle said about how in the United States we really think that something just happened overnight, that Vladimir just woke up and he's like, you know what, I'm going to do a bad thing, take over Ukraine. Whereas there really is so many hundreds of years of history backing his thinking versus something that just happened overnight. So thank you for reaffirming that to me. And strangely, that gives me like hope in humanity, I guess. That no one can be that evil just all at once. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I would say I took some hope from this conversation as well. I mean, like you were saying, people are the way they are for a reason. Countries are the way they are for a reason. We can apply that at any scale. But I think also this whole crisis gives us an opportunity to learn. And I think if we are able to, there's a huge interest in Ukraine right now, and so many people are talking about it like you haven't heard about COVID in weeks,
right.
And so I think that if people really take this opportunity to learn about Ukraine, about Russia, about the history of their people and why this is so important, and have conversations like we are having, I think that it'll put us in a better place for now and for the future as well. And I think there's something to be said as well about unifying together for a valid cause, which at this point is Ukraine.
I couldn't agree more.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We know you're
My
insanely
pleasure.
busy right now, so this is super, super
Thank
nice
you for
of you.
having me.
Thank you.
Perfect.